Emily Harris was the perfect wife, the kind of woman neighbors trusted with their house keys, until the day she vanished, leaving behind a trail of stolen art, missing millions, and an FBI manhunt that revealed her entire life had been a lie. Emily Harris lived in the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew one another and nothing truly dangerous ever seemed to happen. The streets were lined with neat brick houses and trimmed lawns, the kind of place where the mailman waved at children riding their bikes and families gathered for weekend barbecues. To anyone watching from the outside, Emily appeared to be the embodiment of the ideal suburban wife, poised, generous, and endlessly supportive of her husband, Daniel, a well-respected attorney who had built a thriving practice in the city. She volunteered at the local animal shelter twice a week, organized charity bake sales, and sent handwritten thank you notes to neighbors who attended their gatherings. She was the type of person people described as too good to be true, though no one ever meant it as suspicion, only admiration. Inside their two-story home, everything was perfectly in place. Framed photographs captured moments from vacations in Italy, summers at the lake, and anniversary dinners. The kitchen counters were spotless, the living room filled with warm lights spilling from the tall windows, and the faint scent of lavender always seemed to linger in the air. Daniel adored his wife, trusting her completely, never questioning her absences or the times she claimed she needed to visit her elderly aunt in another state. He believed her entirely, because there was nothing about Emily's behavior to suggest anything was wrong. Yet under that flawless surface, Emily carried a secret life, one she had perfected over many years. Beneath the floorboards of their bedroom closet, hidden beneath a false panel, sat a metal lockbox. Inside were passports under different names, stacks of foreign currency, and photographs of cities Daniel had never heard her mention. There were also receipts for cash transactions in distant countries, each folded neatly, as if part of some organized plan. These items were never left in sight. Emily only opened the box late at night when Daniel was asleep or during the few afternoons, when she knew he would be working late. The lockbox was her true identity condensed into a small, silent container, holding a history she never intended anyone to find. The truth was, Emily had not always lived in Westbrook. Years earlier, she had been part of an intricate network that specialized in acquiring and transporting stolen art. She had learned how to blend into crowds, how to alter her appearance with subtle changes, and how to erase traces of her presence. These were skills she never abandoned, even after she met Daniel and tried to step away from the business. For a while, she succeeded in convincing herself that she could leave that part of her life behind. But the network she had been part of had a way of pulling people back in. The money was too easy, the thrill too intoxicating, and the contacts too persistent to ignore on a quiet Tuesday morning. Emily sat at the breakfast table, sipping tea while reading the newspaper. Daniel had already left for the office. She turned the page and saw a headline about a man named Victor Morales, who had gone missing from his downtown apartment without a trace. The article described him as a local art dealer who had recently been involved in a high-value transaction, though details were scarce. Authorities suspected foul play but had found no evidence. No forced entry, no struggle, nothing unusual except for one thing: a set of fingerprints on his desk that did not match anyone in their database. Emily kept reading without any change in her expression, but inside her thoughts moved quickly. She had been in Victor's apartment only a few days earlier. She remembered the way he had smiled nervously as she inspected the rolled canvas he had been holding for a client in Europe. He had promised her the deal was secure, but Emily had known from the moment she stepped through the door that he intended to cheat her. When she left that night, the painting was in her possession, carefully sealed in a weatherproof tube. She had walked out unnoticed, disappearing into the quiet night. Victor's disappearance was now front-page news, but Emily felt no panic. She had taken every precaution, leaving behind no trail she couldn't erase. The fingerprints found by investigators weren't truly hers. They belonged to one of her aliases, tied to an identity that could not be traced back to Emily Harris of Westbrook. She set the paper aside, finished her tea, and began planning her day. To anyone who saw her that morning, she was simply a devoted wife enjoying her breakfast in a beautiful home. But for Emily, it was just another day of living two lives, the one everyone believed in, and the one no one could prove existed. Before Daniel ever came into her life, Emily had lived in places and under names he could never imagine. At 19, she had been drifting through Europe, supporting herself with odd jobs and short-term rentals when she met a man who changed everything. His name wasn't important, at least not his real one, but he was the one who saw her potential. He introduced her to a hidden world that existed alongside the ordinary one, a network of people who moved rare and stolen works of art across borders with precision and stealth. They used coded messages, unmarked couriers, and shifting identities. Transactions worth millions took place in hotel rooms, on private yachts, and in abandoned buildings, each exchange timed and calculated to leave no witnesses. Emily proved to be a natural. She had a calm, observant manner and could walk into a crowded space without drawing attention. She learned how to notice details, cameras hidden in corners, security guards who followed patterns in their patrols, doors that could be opened with the right kind of lockpick. Her talent for memorizing faces and schedules made her valuable, and she quickly became trusted with bigger jobs. She could transport a painting from a gallery in Madrid to a collector in Dubai without anyone realizing it had been missing until days later. Years later, when she met Daniel at a charity event in Chicago, Emily thought she had found a way out. He was steady, grounded, and completely untouched by the dangerous world she knew. For a time, she stayed away from the network, convincing herself that she could have a normal life. They married, moved to Westbrook, and settled into a routine so ordinary it almost felt foreign to her. But the call from her old contacts came. Eventually, and she found herself saying yes before she had fully considered the consequences. First, her return to the business was discreet. She took on small assignments, usually under the guise of visiting distant relatives or attending out-of-town events. She made quick trips to Europe, South America, and Asia, always returning with small, easily hidden items, a jeweled pendant here, a rare manuscript there. She stashed her profits in offshore accounts, careful never to let the money pass directly through her hands in ways that could be traced. Victor Morales was different. He wasn't just another link in the chain, he was a problem. He was a middleman the network relied on for certain high-value transactions, but he had grown greedy. The last job they worked together involved a 19th-century painting stolen from a private collection in New York. Victor had been tasked with holding it briefly before handing it off to a European buyer. Instead, he made plans to sell it himself, keeping the profit and cutting Emily out entirely. She discovered his betrayal through a contact in Barcelona who casually mentioned that Victor had been making inquiries with buyers outside the network. It was an unforgivable move in their world, one that could not go unanswered. Emily flew to the city where Victor lived, using an identity she had used once before in Paris. She stayed in a hotel under a different name, paying in cash, and watched him from a distance for 2 days. She noted when he left his apartment, who he met with, and how often he used his phone. The night she went inside, there was nothing rushed about her movements. The building's security was minimal, and she knew the door locks well. Inside, Victor was nervous but tried to hide it. She inspected the painting, its surface still glowing with the deep colors of oil and varnish. There was no argument, no visible confrontation, only a quiet shift in control. When she left, the painting was hers, rolled securely and hidden in a protective case. Victor was left with nothing, and soon after, he was gone entirely. When news of his disappearance broke, Emily understood the FBI would be watching closely. They would connect him to the art theft, and they would search for the woman who had last been seen in his orbit. But the identity she had used for that meeting no longer existed in any official record. The trail would lead nowhere. Back in Westbrook, she slipped into her familiar routine, smiling at neighbors, attending charity meetings, and preparing dinners for Daniel. He noticed nothing unusual, and no one in their quiet suburb had any reason to think she had spent the last week orchestrating a theft worth millions. To them, Emily Harris was still the kind of person who baked pies for new neighbors and remembered birthdays. And that was exactly how she intended to keep it. Daniel began to notice changes, so subtle they could almost be dismissed. A credit card charge from a hotel in Amsterdam, even though Emily had claimed to be visiting her aunt in Vermont. A fuel receipt from a city 2 states away, tucked into the pocket of a jacket she hadn't worn in months. When he asked, she gave. Explanations so ordinary they left little room for doubt. Delays in airline connections, a friend needing her help, a last-minute errand. Her voice was steady, her gaze calm, and the answers seemed to close the matter each time. Daniel told himself he was imagining things. Meanwhile, the FBI's Art Crimes Division had not abandoned the Morales investigation. The missing painting had resurfaced in Italy under circumstances that only deepened their suspicion. The sale had been conducted through an untraceable auction, but witnesses remembered the seller, a woman with refined manners, speaking English with a polished British accent. Her description matched no one in their records, but one detail stood out: her resemblance to a woman involved in a smuggling case nearly a decade earlier. That woman had vanished before she could be identified. Investigators began combing through international flight manifests, looking for any names that appeared both before and after Morales' disappearance. That was when they found it: two separate passenger entries for the same flight into Rome, one for Emily Harris, the other for an alias connected to that old smuggling case. To the FBI, it was a potential breakthrough. To Emily, it was an expected risk. She had been in this position before and knew exactly how to make a lead dissolve into nothing. Her confidence came from experience. She understood how to manipulate timing, how to place misleading information where investigators would waste time chasing it. A bank transfer routed through multiple accounts in different countries. A forged hotel registration that appeared authentic to anyone who didn't know where to look. Even her movements in airports were calculated, always changing hairstyles, wearing different styles of clothing, and altering the way she walked to appear as someone entirely different from one trip to the next. Still, she knew they were getting closer. A small article buried in the back of a financial news site mentioned an anonymous tip linking her to Morales. The source wasn't identified, but Emily had a suspicion. The network she operated in had no room for weakness, and rivals were always looking for a way to move up. Someone, somewhere, wanted her removed. This possibility forced her to reassess her plans. She began limiting her trips, storing sensitive items in places Daniel would never think to look. She reduced communication with certain contacts and refused jobs that required physical meetings. But she didn't stop entirely. The money was still coming in, flowing quietly into accounts under names she had created years ago. Daniel remained unaware of how deep the deception ran. To him, the inconsistencies were minor, and his trust in Emily was strong enough to keep him from prying further. The neighbors saw no change. She still greeted them with warmth, brought cookies to community events, and kept up the appearance of a content marriage. The FBI, however, was moving forward. They began quietly monitoring her travel patterns and financial footprint, mapping connections that might tie her to the network. Yet, each time they believed they had found a link, it unraveled. The identity used in Rome had been erased from public record, and the offshore accounts showed no obvious ties to her name. The harder they pushed, the more elusive she became. For Emily, this was not just a matter of avoiding arrest. It was a test of her ability to maintain two lives without letting them bleed into each other. Every smile she gave at a neighborhood barbecue, every polite nod to someone at the grocery store, was part of a performance that had to be flawless. A single mistake could collapse everything she had built, both the respectable life with Daniel and the far more dangerous one that funded it. The threat from within her own network was more unsettling than the FBI. A rival could act faster, without the constraints of legal procedure. She had seen others in her position disappear without a trace, their wealth and contacts absorbed by someone else. To protect herself, she began watching for signs: an unfamiliar car parked too long on their street, a stranger lingering in a cafe where she met a contact, a message that arrived in a different format than usual. Each night, as Daniel slept beside her, she would lie awake, replaying the steps she had taken, searching for gaps in her precautions. Her life depended on being certain there were none. And while the FBI continued to circle and her rivals closed in, Emily knew the real danger wasn't that they would find her. It was that they might discover who she really was before she was ready to disappear again. The decision to move against her came quietly. Emily had been aware for weeks that the FBI's interest was deepening, but when the first signs of a setup appeared, she recognized them instantly. It started with a message sent through one of her supposedly secure channels. The sender claimed to have a valuable sculpture available, a piece so rare it could attract a private buyer willing to pay millions in cash. The message was crafted to appear as if it had come from an established contact within her network. Everything about it seemed legitimate at first glance, but Emily knew better than to trust appearances. Still, she also understood the value of staying visible within the network. If she refused too many offers, questions would arise about her reliability. Accepting the job would be dangerous, but turning it down could be worse. She agreed to a meeting, taking every precaution she had learned over years of operating in the shadows. The location provided was an old warehouse in a quiet industrial area, a place with enough privacy for the exchange, but not so secluded as to raise suspicion. And on the day of the meeting, Emily moved with precision. She left her home dressed in understated clothing, switching vehicles twice before arriving near the warehouse. She carried the sculpture in a protective case, having arranged for the genuine piece to be shipped to an undisclosed location days earlier. The object she brought with her was an exact replica, flawless to the untrained eye, worthless to anyone who tried to sell it. This was not carelessness on her part, it was a safeguard. She never attended a meeting without ensuring she had the upper hand. The warehouse was dimly lit, its air thick with dust. The buyer was already waiting, accompanied by two silent men who stood near the entrance. Emily assessed the space in seconds, multiple exits, one overhead loft, and no obvious sign of hidden cameras. Still, she assumed surveillance was in place. Every movement was deliberate. She placed the case on a crate, unlocked it, and revealed the sculpture. The buyer examined it briefly, asked no unnecessary questions, and confirmed the payment details. Through a device Emily knew could be monitored, she watched his body language carefully. There was a stiffness to his posture, a precision to his actions that suggested training rather than casual negotiation. That was when the shift happened. A faint sound echoed from somewhere above, a scrape of metal, the kind that comes from equipment being moved. Within moments, the warehouse doors opened, and agents poured in from every direction. Emily did not panic. She stepped back from the crate, her face unreadable. They moved toward her quickly, expecting a clean arrest. But when they opened the case and inspected the sculpture, the realization spread among them. It was not the original. The one they had been hoping to recover was already beyond their reach. In the brief moment of distraction, Emily acted. She had positioned herself near one of the side exits and slipped through it before the agents could close in. Outside, she was already moving toward the nearest street, blending with the handful of workers leaving nearby buildings. By the time the FBI realized she was gone, she had switched vehicles again and was heading away from the city. The failed sting left them with nothing concrete. No authentic artwork recovered, no proof linking her to the broader network, no usable evidence of her role in Morales' disappearance. Officially, she remained only a person of interest, but internally, the frustration was mounting. Emily knew this close call was different from the others. It meant the FBI had access to her communications, or at least enough knowledge of her habits to replicate them convincingly. It also meant someone within her own network had helped them. That betrayal narrowed the list of people she could trust to almost none. Back in Westbrook, she resumed her normal routine, but every gesture felt heavier. She was aware of the possibility that she was being watched even in her own home. Trips outside were calculated, each one layered with misdirection. She avoided using her phone for anything sensitive, relying instead on coded messages sent through obscure channels only she understood. The sting had been intended to trap her, but it had also given her valuable information. She now knew which of her identities the FBI was targeting and which routes were no longer safe. Most importantly, she knew that if they had been able to find her this time, they could try again, and next time, they might be closer to success. What neither the FBI nor her rivals realized was that Emily had already begun planning her exit. The lockbox beneath the floorboards was nearly empty now, its contents moved to locations far beyond their reach. The question was no longer whether she could stay in Westbrook. It was how quickly she could disappear before someone forced her hand. Daniel woke to an unsettling silence. The faint sounds of morning, the coffee machine starting, the clink of cups were absent. The house felt different, as though something essential had been removed overnight. Emily's side of the bed was empty, the covers neatly folded back. He called her name, but there was no answer. In the closet, her dresses still hung in their usual order, and her shoes lined the floor in careful rows. At first, he thought she might have gone for an early errand, but the unease grew when he noticed the absence of her handbag, the small leather one she always carried. The more he looked, the stranger things became. The lockbox he had once glimpsed under a layer of folded blankets in the closet was gone. He hadn't thought much about it before, assuming it held old documents or sentimental items, but now the empty space where it had been seemed deliberate. Her laptop was missing from the desk. On the kitchen counter, her phone lay face down, powered off, as if left behind intentionally to prevent tracking that Daniel's calls to her relatives yielded nothing. No one had heard from her or expected a visit. The last time anyone saw her was the day before, walking home from the corner store with a bag of groceries, smiling at a neighbor who passed by. She had appeared entirely at ease, giving no indication. She was about to vanish. For the FBI, the disappearance was confirmation of what they had long suspected. Emily had evaded their sting operation and now had slipped entirely out of sight. They moved quickly, checking airport footage, border crossings, and international flight manifests. But she had left no obvious trail. In the days before her disappearance, she had avoided using her own car for extended trips and had relied on rental vehicles under names that didn't belong to her. The few security cameras she passed caught only indistinct glimpses, enough to confirm she was there, but never clear. Enough to identify her with certainty. Weeks later, an investigator came across a lead. A woman matching Emily's description had been seen on a ferry traveling between two Greek islands. She was using a new name, wearing her hair shorter, dressed in loose clothing that concealed her figure. By the time agents reached the coastal villa where she was believed to be staying, the property was empty. The rooms were spotless, the refrigerator cleaned out, no personal belongings left behind. Even the garbage bins outside had been washed and turned upside down. To Daniel, the revelation of who she might have been was devastating. He had built a life with her, believing they shared everything, only to learn that the woman he loved had lived in a world of shadows and deception. There were moments, looking back, that now seemed obvious. The unexplained absences, the calm way she handled sudden disruptions, the guarded way she spoke about her past. He began to wonder if he had ever truly known her at all. The FBI kept the case open, adding her to multiple watch lists, circulating her photograph to agencies across Europe and South America. But within the art theft circles Emily had once navigated, her name became almost a legend. She had outmaneuvered both law enforcement and her own rivals, disappearing without leaving so much as a fingerprint behind. Whispers suggested she was still active, working under yet another identity, moving high-value pieces across borders for select clients who could afford her services. There were unconfirmed sightings, a woman at a private auction in Hong Kong, another stepping off a yacht in Monte Carlo, a fleeting figure in the background of a photograph taken in Buenos Aires. None were ever proven to be her. For those still chasing her, the most frustrating truth was that Emily always seemed to be just out of reach, as if she knew their every move before they made it. Years passed, but the absence in Daniel's life never closed. He kept the house in Westbrook much the same, unable to part with the things they had shared, even though they now felt like relics of a false life. Sometimes he imagined her somewhere far away, walking through a crowded market, blending in perfectly with strangers who had no idea who she really was. That Emily's story became one of those rare cases where the lines between myth and fact blurred. The FBI could confirm dates, places, and certain transactions, but the full scope of her activities remained hidden. She had built a life on controlling information, and in the end, she left them with only fragments. Whether she was still out there, watching carefully from a safe distance, or had retired to some remote place where no one could find her, remained a mystery. For Daniel, the truth was less about where she had gone and more about the realization that she had been preparing to leave long before the day she disappeared. Everything else, the perfect marriage, the warm home, the small-town life, had been just another layer of her cover.